Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. I often recommend buying used gear, especially when it comes to DSLR cameras and lenses, because you can save yourself a lot of money. But how can you actually make sure that you're buying good used gear and not a dud? Because there might be lenses that look perfectly fine on the outside, have no scratches or any marks, but are broken on the inside. And then there might be lenses that look like a tank has driven over them, but they're actually working perfectly fine. You can get yourself a great deal. So how can you find out what's a good buy? To help you with that process, I'm going to share my top tips with you on buying used gear and making sure that it's actually working. Before we get into the details of buying used gear, I think you have to ask yourself, is buying used gear for you? Or do you prefer to pay a little bit more and have that peace of mind that there's a manufacturer's warranty, there's a shop you can talk to, and you also know that the gear is new, it has never been drowned or dropped or anything else bad has happened to it. But of course you're paying a lot more money for that extra peace of mind. So let's look into how you can get a good deal and good gear. So the first question when it comes to buying used gear is actually where to buy it. I've talked to a few friends of mine as well, and we all agree that those old school PHP forums that not many people frequent anymore are actually probably the best place to buy gear because there's a few advantages. Usually these forums are frequented by real enthusiasts like you and I, and they generally look after the gear, and you can also get an idea about who the buyer is because if they have lots and lots of posts in the forum, you can generally assume that they're also fairly trustworthy. So that's why I think these forums are one of the best sources to buy gear. Of course, there's other places as well, like Gumtree or Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, all these kind of places. They're also very good for buying and selling gear, and I've sold a lot of gear there. I haven't bought too much gear on there. The main thing there is that you have to be a lot more aware of who you're buying from, because there's a lot more scammers out there and people trying to rip you off, or there might be stolen gear or gear that's not quite in the same conditions as the photos might suggest on there. So it's still a good place, especially if you're selling gear, but you have to be a little bit more cautious when you're buying gear, and you probably want to meet the people somewhere in person to at least be able to check the gear before buying. You can also buy a gear from a normal store, like a camera store. The only downside there is then that you're paying a much higher price, which might actually negate the main reason for buying used gear, which is getting a good deal. You get the peace of mind, but you're paying a much higher price, so it's not really my preferred option when it comes to buying used gear. And the best option there is probably buying from people that you know or other people know are trustworthy and treat their gear well. And also, if you might not be able to check out the gear in person, it will allow you to at least get an idea of who the seller is and whether they're trustworthy. Where do you guys buy used gear? Do you have a certain place? Have you had good experiences or bad experiences? Make sure to let me know in the comments. So let's talk about camera bodies first, and the main thing to look out for here is the shutter actuations. Obviously, a camera with lower shutter actuations will be more valuable than one that has a lot of shutter actuations. In the past, it used to be fairly easy to just grab a RAW file and then you were able to read out the shutter actuations, but this doesn't work anymore with newer cameras, and only the manufacturers or certain software are actually able to read out how many shutter actuations are there. So in a way, you have to trust the seller a bit in that regard. But I also must say that high shutter actuations are not necessarily that bad. For instance, I've sold a 5D Mark III with 488,000 shutter actuations. So that was very high, way beyond the lifespan of what Canon says the shutter can take, but it was still working completely fine. Obviously, I had to sell it pretty cheap because the buyer is basically incorporating the potential cost of exchanging the shutter, which is usually like $500 to $1,000. So that's something that you have to keep in mind if you were buying a camera with high shutter actuations, but you might actually also get a good deal on a camera with very many clicks. So generally speaking, maybe the 50 to 60,000 shutter actuation range might be quite interesting because it's not totally new anymore and you're paying a higher price, but it's also not that used that you might have to be concerned with the shutter breaking on you very soon. So that might be a range for getting a good deal. When it comes to the camera body itself, once I decided the shutter actuations are fine, I'm going to buy the camera, I'm going to grab it, I'm going to look at things like the screen, is it all going fine? Do the buttons work? Are the wheels spinning? Is there any sand? Are there any noticeable marks? Is the battery door working fine? Does it stay shut? Are there any potential issues with the card slot? So I would grab a card and put it in both slots and make sure the camera can write to both of these cards. And I'll also turn it on and look at things like the sensor to make sure that that's looking nice and fine. There's no marks or smears or scratches on the sensor. And if all that looks fine, that's basically when the camera passes my visual test and I go on to doing some tests to actually make sure that it's working. But before that, we should talk about lenses first, and then I'll tell you exactly how to test the gear. Also, if you want to learn all about image editing and how to take your raw images and transform them into amazing looking final images, make sure to check out my PROSETS and Masterclass down there in the description, where I teach you step by step how to make your own images stand out. So let's talk about lenses, because I would generally say lenses are easier to buy used. There's less moving parts, and also lenses seem to keep their value very well. So if you buy a used lens, it's not uncommon that a few years later you can basically sell it again for the same price. So that's very attractive. Also, for instance, if you want to just try out a lens rather than buying it new and losing a few $100s after reselling it, it might be a good idea to buy a used lens, use it for a while. If you don't like it, you can sell it probably for the same price that you bought it for. So I think in that regard, lenses are very attractive. If there's a UV filter in front of the lens, that's fantastic news for you, because you know that the seller actually never had the front lens exposed to the elements. However, he or she will have likely taken worse images because of the filter. So the first thing you do when you see a UV filter on a lens that you're buying is being excited that there is one, then taking it off and throwing it away, because you will take much better images without it. And if you don't believe me, check out the comments on a few videos like how to take sharper images, where there's so many people thanking me for letting them know to take off the UV filter, because miraculously their lenses have become much sharper by just taking off that one filter. So as a protection, if you're buying a lens, it's great, but I wouldn't recommend using UV filters at all in front of your lenses, because your image quality will suffer in most cases. So what to look out for when buying a lens? First, just like with the camera body, I do a visual test of all the external areas. I look at the body, I make sure there's no major dents or scratches. I look at the rear of the lens, I make sure the contacts look fine, the rubber seal is there. I look at the rear glass to make sure there's no scratches there. I also take off the front cap and the lens hood, make sure that goes on and off easy. Also make sure there's no scratches on the front element. And then I turn all the wheels, make sure they turn smoothly, it's zooming smoothly, and there's no scratching sound from like a lot of dirt or sand within the lens. Then I flick the buttons. So this lens, it's actually a pretty new one, so it passes the test perfectly. Here I have another example of an older lens that's a little bit more iffy, because on the outside it looks worn, but it still works fine. Everything is turning, all the buttons are working. The rubber is a little bit broken, the golden contacts are not as smooth anymore, but they're definitely still fine. However, when we take the cap off now, we can see that there's no scratches, but actually a lot of dust. So if you were looking at this lens, this could definitely be a problem. Because this is my lens, I know that the dust doesn't actually show up in the photos or videos. But if I was going to buy this lens used, this would certainly be a cause for concern. So I would have to do some serious tests to make sure that the dust isn't affecting my images and videos. And I would also ask for a huge discount from the seller, because the dust is just not something you would want to have in your lens. It's not something that's easily fixed either. Other things you definitely have to look out for inside the lenses also, any sort of mold, because you don't want any mold or fungi within your lens. It usually looks like a bit of frost on the glass or small little spider webs. You don't want any of that in your lens, because that will just ruin the lens and will only get worse. There's one more thing I should say about the newer RF lenses like this 100 to 500. You can see there's actually something shaking within, but that's just the image stabilization unit that basically never is fully fixed. That's not a cause for concern, but generally speaking, you don't want to see any sort of loose moving parts in the lens, but with the RF lenses, that's something that's normal. It's the same like with this R5. If I shake it, you can hear a little sound, but that's just the IBIS in the camera that's also a little bit loose, so that's also not a cause for concern. But generally speaking, with DSLR cameras, for instance, you don't really want to have any sound when you shake it. So let's talk about how you can quickly find out in that short period of time that you have with the seller when buying the gear, whether your camera or lens you're buying works or not. First of all, I would always bring a trusted piece of my own equipment with me. If I'm buying a lens, I would bring one of my R5 bodies that I know works very well. And if I was buying a camera body, I would bring a lens that I know works very well. By doing so, you know that at least one part of the equation works for sure and that the other part that you're testing is either working or not working. If you're buying a lens and a camera together, it might be a good idea to still bring a different lens and camera that you know that are also working. So you can test the combo you're buying, but you can also test the two pieces individually to make sure everything is fine. The first test I always do when buying a lens is to make sure that the lens is properly centered internally and that all the corners have about the same sharpness. A lens is always the sharpest in the middle and the edges and corners will be slightly softer. So the test that I do for this is I put the lens on my trusted camera and focus on something, maybe the house number, a street sign, a car tire, not too big in my frame, maybe 10 to 15 meters away. Something that you can put first in the center of the frame, could also be like a street sign. Then you take a shot with it in the center of the frame, zoom in, and hopefully that's sharp. That should be sharp. If that's not sharp at all, we have other problems going on. And what I do then is I move my camera up and over. So now the subject is in the lower right corner. Take a few images, then I move it up to the upper right corner, then over to the upper left corner, and then down to the lower left corner. You obviously want to shoot wide open. You don't want to stop down to like f11 because then even the corners will be sharp. And now I look at all these four images together. The image in the center should be the sharpest. But when I'm actually now looking at the corners, I want to see that it's not as sharp as the center, but close to the sharpness of the center. And I also want to see that the sharpness in all four corners is essentially the same. You don't want to have a lens that's sharp in the center, very sharp in two corners, and then very soft in one or two of the other corners. If that's the case, it usually means that the lens isn't centered properly, and I would just step away from that lens because that's not something that can be fixed or can be quite expensive to be fixed. Once the lens passes this test, I'm moving on to just checking whether the image stabilization works well and the autofocus works well. The image stabilization, when you hold it in your hand, should be nice, slow, smooth movements. What you don't want with the image stabilization is any sort of jerky moves where it jumps up and down, jumps from the left to the right, or jumps up in the corner, hops around. That's something I'm looking for, and if it's jumping around, I would generally be concerned, unless I know it's a lens like 150 to 600 lens that has that problem on all R5 cameras, for instance, then I might be able to look past it. But with most lenses, I don't want the IS, the image stabilization, or VR on a Nikon lens to make any sort of jerky moves. Another good way to test this as well, especially on the newer cameras, that you can zoom in, change the magnification on your EVF, or on a DSLR camera you can also zoom in with the live view, and then it's even more easy for you to see if there's any weird movements with the image stabilization. If it's too jerky, just move on, find a different lens. When it comes to the autofocus, I would always test it from the minimum focusing distance onto my subject, and then I would focus all the way past it onto the infinity, and then focus back on my subject. And the autofocus in these tests should just nice and smooth in one motion go to your subject. Another thing I would do, ideally there might be some cars, people, animals hopping around, so I would also put the camera in servo mode and just try and track something quickly to make sure that the tracking is also nice and smooth. Another test I always do when buying cameras, or also when I'm buying a lens where I'm concerned with, like this lens that has a lot of dust in it, I would put it on the camera and then I would stop down to like f22, f32 and take a picture of the bright sky. Then on that picture you will see any sort of dust on the sensor. Especially if you're using a camera, this can be important because a little bit of dust spots can be okay, that can be removed. Definitely don't want to see any sort of smears or scratches or lines on the sensor when you're stopping down. If that's the case, you know someone tried to clean it, or there's some oil on the sensor or something shady going on. If there's one or two tiny little spots, that's not a problem. You can easily clean that with some solution. But if there's marks, scratches, lines, smears, step away from it and don't buy that camera. This is another area where it helps to bring a trusted camera or a trusted lens to a test, because if I'm bringing my R5 to buy a lens, I know my sensor is clean, there's no dust spots. So if I stop down, I see a lot of dirt, I know that dirt is within the lens. One thing to consider when you're buying bigger prime lenses is that they have these drop-in filters here. So sometimes a lens might look really dirty, but all it is this drop-in filter being dirty. So I would always check for that and make sure that is clean, because that sometimes might already get rid of all the problems you're seeing. Another test I like to do, especially with DSLR cameras and lenses, is to make sure that the camera actually focuses on the point that I want to focus on. To do this test, I usually position myself in like a 45-degree angle to like a sign or book or license plate, something that has a nice text on it. By positioning myself on an angle, I can focus somewhere in the middle of the text and then see how the sharpness falls off kind of in front and behind that text. And when I zoom in to 100%, I want to see that the sharpness is actually right on the spot where I focused and then equally falls off in like both directions. If something isn't quite right, you will see that the text in front of where you focus is sharp or behind of where you focus is sharp. So if that's within reason, you know something is wrong and you can probably still use the micro adjustment to fix it if you're buying a DSLR camera. If you're buying a mirrorless camera or a lens for a mirrorless camera and it doesn't focus on the spot that you're focusing on, I would be concerned and not buy that lens, because on a mirrorless camera, the lens should always focus exactly on the spot that you're focusing on. You don't want to buy something where it's really far out and way behind where you focused or way in front of where you focused. And if nothing is sharp at all, I would definitely walk away. With all focus tests, make sure that you're not just taking one photo. For instance, when you're doing the center and the corner test, take like 5 images of each corner, 5 images of the center, or when you're testing the test with the text on an angle, make sure you're also taking 5 or 6 different shots and also refocus in between, because we want to make sure we don't accidentally have a little focusing error and then seeing something that doesn't actually exist. So by doing 3, 4, 5 test shots and refocusing every time, it will be better. Let's talk about how you might get yourself a killer deal. Because all the high-end gear from Canon, Nikon and Sony is built very well and can withstand a lot. So you might find some gear that looks very bad on the outside, but all the damage is just superficial. So there might be some missing paint, there might be a little dent here or there, but none of that actually affects the function of the lens. But because most people don't want to buy it, you probably will be able to get a really good deal on a lens like this. So if you get the lens and you test it and you're happy that it's sharp in the corners and sharp in the center and also focuses properly, there's nothing wrong with buying a lens like this that might not look perfectly fine, but you might be able to get it very cheaply because the seller is probably motivated to sell it because most people won't buy it. At the very end, I want to give you a few more tips as well. The first one is I would always ask whether the seller also has the original receipt or the receipt from whoever he bought it from, because it will allow you to see that it was not stolen. It's also not a gray import. Gray imports in general are not terrible, but I would always be a bit cautious because some of the manufacturers are not willing to service gray imports. Gray imports are basically equipment bought in another country and then brought to the country you're residing in. So usually manufacturers like Canon are willing to service lenses that are gray imports, but I've heard a lot of times that they are a little bit difficult when it comes to servicing gray imported cameras. So I would just be conscious of that fact. Another important factor to consider is that on the older lenses, for Canon for instance, the big prime lenses, the version 1 lenses, some of the older zoom lenses like a version 2 or version 1 70 to 200mm lens, they're not being serviced anymore by Canon, and there are also no spare parts anymore available. So while some of these lenses are actually quite cheap, you have to remember that if you buy it and it breaks, you will likely have to throw it away. And then another tip, usually I like to buy from people who still have like the box and all the pouches and everything the camera and or lens came with. Not that that really matters, but generally people who keep this kind of stuff also look after the gear very well, and that's just another little thing to sometimes pick between sellers to find the right one that you can trust the most. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that these tips will help you to find the right used gear for you, make sure that it works fine, and then save you a ton of money and frustration. What are your experiences with used gear? Do you have bad ones, good ones, buying or selling? Let me know in the comments. Like always, make sure to give me a thumbs up for this video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in my next video very soon. Bye guys.